Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about fiscal policy. In our past lecture, we talked about the monetary policy, which is one of the tools that the government would use to influence the economy. And today we're going to talk about a second set of tools that the government would use to influence the set of the economy, which is fiscal policy. So here we have fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the second tool or set of tools that the government would use to influence the economy, as we mentioned earlier. So what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is actually controlling the taxation or the taxes or the government revenue and the expenditure in order to alter the economy. How does the government work? The government would collect taxes and other sources of revenues to finance its expenditure, like paving roads, supporting universities, giving grants, etc. So by changing the taxation level and the expenditure of the government, the government can alter the condition of the economy. This is actually related to the public budget, which is a future plan for the government stating how much they expect to collect in the future and how much do they actually planning to spend this money that the government will collect. Fiscal policy has three main goals. It tries to reach full employment, which means that everyone have a job. We are under natural unemployment. It actually tries to keep inflation in check and to reach sustainable growth. As you can see, it's the same goals for the monetary policy, which actually had four goals. Three of them is common with fiscal policy, which are full employment, inflation in check, not very high inflation or hyperinflation, and not negative inflation, sustainable growth that actually will go continuously. So let's dig deeper. Let's look what is fiscal policy is about. Well, in this unit, we will know who are the main players when it comes to fiscal policy. In monetary policy, the main player was the central bank. Here we have two players, the executive authority and the legislative authority. This is mainly the common way that it goes in most of the countries of the world. So in Egypt, like in the United States, the public budget is actually a project that will take place or will be authenticated by both the cabinet of ministers and the legislative authority. So when it comes to our budget, which is a plan of how much revenues we are going to collect and how we are going to spend it, we have three conditions or three status. Either that the revenues will equal to the expenditure. So here we're gonna call our budget as a balanced budget. Expenditure is more than our revenues. This means that we have a deficit. Expenditure is less than the revenues, or the revenues are more than the expenditure. This means that we have a surplus. Question is, if our expenditure is higher than our revenues, how we gonna finance it? Similar to us, if we are spending more than our income, we actually will go either for our all savings or to make loans. Same case goes for the government. When the government spend more than it is revenue, it actually would use its reserve, which is past saving for a country, or it's gonna increase the public debt. So what do we mean by a public debt? A public debt is the total amount that the government borrowed or the government owes. This means that someone is claiming money from the government that accumulates all the past deficits. This means that the more deficits we generate, the larger is our debt. And vice versa. When there is a surplus, this actually will decrease our public debt. This graph actually, or this panel is showing us the distribution of the public debt all over the world. You can see that the country with the biggest debt all over the world is the United States. It comes at the first place. Second comes Japan. What does this mean? United States is #1 economy all over the world. How come a country that with this advancement in technology has this large level of debt? The high level of debt doesn't mean or doesn't represent any indicator to economic development or that this country is developed or not developed. We can see here that the United States is actually a very huge economy, but also with a very huge debt. Same case goes for Japan. We usually, when we evaluate the public debt, we have to put it as a percentage from the GDP. So when it comes to Japan, it's very vivid that here we have a big ratio to the GDP which exceeds 200%, which means that the public debt of Japan is over twice its GDP. However, the good news is 90% of the debt of Japan is actually held domestically. What do I mean by that? The government debt or the public debt either to be domestically, which means that the government is taking the loans from the people of the country, or to be foreign debt that we're actually taking this loan from other countries. So the higher the debt from foreign currency, from foreign countries, means a higher risk. However, domestically the risk will be less. Well, now we're ready to talk about fiscal policy. We know that fiscal policy now is about altering or changing taxation and government expenditure in order to alter the conditions of the economy. We also know that we have three stages of the budget. One of them where the expenditure exceeds the revenue. In this case, government has to take debt or to actually use its past reserve. Public debt is not an indicator for economic development. Doesn't mean that when you have a high public debt, doesn't mean that you are not advanced when it comes to economic performance. Now let's talk about our next part in fiscal policy, which is how do we use the economic policy to influence the economy. Well, we have here on the top of our panel, we have the expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy means that I have a recession and I need to stimulate the economy. How to use fiscal policy to do so? By reducing taxes and increasing government expenditure. So when we reduce taxes, people will have more money to spend, companies will have more money to invest, and this actually will increase consumption and increase investment. When there is an increase in consumption, increase in investment, this will increase the aggregate demand in the economy, causing GDP to increase and maybe inflation to go up, and this will generate more jobs, unemployment will go down. In the lower part of our figure, we have the contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy main purpose is to fight inflation. Here the economy is under heat. Prices are going up. I want to control the demand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise the taxes, decrease the government purchases or the government expenditure. So when I raise taxes, people will find themselves with this money to spend. Companies will find themselves with this money to invest, and this will, and also the G, which is the government expenditure, will go down too. All of these will contribute to a lower aggregate demand. Lowering the aggregate demand will cause the GDP to growth to slow down and the inflation rate to slow down too. And maybe this will lead to a a higher unemployment. Okay, let's continue. If you do remember, when we were talking about the multiplier, we stated that the change in autonomous expenditure will cause a bigger exchange. If you remember in our chapter of multiplier, we stated that the change in the autonomous expenditure will cause a greater change in the GDP. And we stated that the autonomous expenditure are government purchases, investment, and exports. So as government purchases is part of our budget, we are here back to discuss this. So we have the government purchases multiplier. We already explained multiplier when we're talking about investment. Here we have the same case, but it actually goes for the government purchases. Government purchases will actually change the aggregate expenditure and real GDP. A multiplier, because the government purchases are component of aggregate expenditure, the government purchases increase the aggregate expenditure and cause an additional consumption expenditure. So when the government increases its expenditure, it will lead to a higher income. This actually will induce a higher consumption, and this will cause the GDP to increase by more than the initial increase in the government purchases. Let's look graphically. So back to our friend, the aggregate expenditure curve. We have on the x-axis the real GDP, on the y-axis we have the aggregate expenditure, the 45 degrees line where x equals y, and aggregate expenditure curve going upward with the price level. So when there is an increase in the government expenditure by 0.5, we can see that the equilibrium have moved from B, 10 trillion of real GDP, to 2, which is actually 12, which moved from B to D, which is 12 trillion of GDP. So 0.5 trillion of government purchases has caused 2 trillion increase in the GDP. It has multiplied 4 times. We're gonna use the same law that we used to calculate the multiplier in the case of investment, which was 1/1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, which in our case is 4. Well, we have another multiplier that's related to the lump sum tax. So what would be the effect of the government increasing its taxes over the aggregate expenditure? So taxes has an effect over the real GDP. An increase in a lump sum tax will decrease disposable income. What do we mean by disposable income? The income that people can spend. So by increasing tax, this means that people have less available income to spend, which will affect the consumption, decrease the aggregate expenditure and the real GDP. Well, an increase of $1 in lump sum tax will actually increase the expenditure, the consumption, by 1 times marginal propensity to consume. So if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, this means that each dollar increase in the lump sum taxes will decrease the consumption by $0.8. How do we calculate it? We use the law minus marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus marginal propensity to consume. Let's look graphically. So real GDP on the x-axis, aggregate expenditure on the y, and we have the aggregate expenditure curve, 45 degrees line, and an equilibrium at the point A, 10 trillion of GDP. Well, the government decided to increase the lump sum tax. So this decrease in a lump sum tax was translated by 1 trillion, was translated into 3 trillion decrease in the GDP. So increasing taxes would decrease the aggregate expenditure by more than the initial increase in the taxation. Why? It's the same function of the multiplier. As consumption goes down, this means that less income, and this will induce further reduction in expenditure. So How do we calculate it? It's minus MPC, marginal propensity of consume, over 1 minus MPC, which is marginal propensity to consume. At this chapter, we talked about fiscal policy. How does it alter the economy? What are the main objectives of the fiscal policy? How it is conducted? How it is related to the public debt? And somehow we talked about the relationship between public debt and economic development. We have seen the multiplier of the government purchases, and we have seen the multiplier of the lump sum tax. Stay safe. Hope you all the best.